The realist viewpoint, expounded by a variety of people, Professor Mearsheimer wrote an article blaming the West last summer in the Foreign Affairs, blaming the West, not really Russia, for this escalation of conflict, using the analogy that the US in the 1960s wouldn't allow the Soviet Union to put nuclear weapons into Cuba, next door to the United States, and therefore why would we think today that Russia would allow Ukraine to join the EU and NATO? And although this took place, well, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place half a century ago, for some reason it's been brought up again today. This morning I was on a similar kind of debate with a gentleman from the National Interest magazine. This is published by the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C., which has always had a very pro-Russian viewpoint and also this realist viewpoint. The member of the National Interest Journal argued similarly to Professor Mearsheimer that, in effect, Ukraine should capitulate. What do I mean by that? Well, he said that sending arms to Ukraine would be a mistake, economic sanctions don't work, the only way is to negotiate with Russia, which of course is a bit strange to argue now because nobody believes a word that's coming out of Russian leaders' mouths, because they didn't implement a single article of the Minsk Accords from last September. But nevertheless, he believes in negotiations, and that Ukraine, through the European Union, through Chancellor Merkel and President Holland, who are now in Moscow, should be pushed to accept both the federalization of Ukraine, giving incredible amount of autonomy to these regions in Donbas, and also to sign a document saying that they would never have an interest in joining the EU or NATO. To my mind, this is capitulation. This is, in effect, giving Putin everything he wanted, giving the imperialist aggressor really all the gains, all the objectives that he wanted to secure by invading and supporting his proxies and leading to the murder and deaths of over 6,000 civilian casualties and probably a far higher number of military casualties on both sides. This argument is not going to be acceptable. I mean, the two no's have always been true inside Ukraine, and that is no to federalism and no to autonomy. These are dirty words throughout Eastern Europe because of the legacy of the Soviet and communist systems. And President Poroshenko only a few days ago said that there cannot be a federal solution to Ukraine's domestic internal conflict. And the idea that some kind of autonomy would be given is also unlikely. Ukraine has always said that the only region of the country that was given autonomy was the Crimea, because the Crimea was the only region which had a non-Ukrainian ethnic majority, i.e. Russians. Everywhere else, Ukrainians were in a majority, and therefore there was no need for some kind of autonomous status. Yes, the country needs urgently to reform its still Soviet-era territorial administrative system, which means decentralization. Ukraine is way over-centralized. Certainly you need decentralization, and in certain regions of the country, such as Transcarpathia, maybe southern Ukraine, Odesa, and particularly the Donbas, you would need some kind of arrangement, which there are many examples in Europe from which you can draw, which would be higher and more deeper than a free economic zone, but not as deep as a political autonomy. So somewhere in between the two. And you can call it in a variety of names: self-regulated region, some kind of territorial deregulation, whatever. That certainly is on the cards. So I don't believe that President Poroshenko and certainly the Ukrainian parliament would accept some kind of federalism, and certainly the idea that Ukraine would turn its back on EU and NATO membership is also something unlikely with the Ukrainian parliament, particularly because a year ago people were willing to die and to stand on the Euromaidan in support of European integration. And remember, it was President Viktor Yanukovych's turning away from the European Union in November of 2013 that sparked the Euromaidan. So the idea that this could somehow be stopped or turned around with some deal with Moscow is unlikely. But it also shows a certain, not only Russophilia, but certain, I would say, naivety amongst the realists. First of all, I don't know anybody who actually believes a word that Foreign Minister Lavrov and President Putin actually say, because they come from that Soviet-Russian Eurasian culture that lying is just part and parcel of everyday activity. We know the joke that how do we know when Foreign Minister Lavrov is lying? When he opens his mouth. So especially because they signed up to the Minsk Peace Accords in September, the separatists and their Russian backers have never implemented a single article. How do we know that even if the Ukrainians agreed to these Mearsheimer and realist positions now put forward that Russia would like, that Russia would not then invade other parts of Ukraine or demand other things from the Ukrainian leadership? And it's not the case that somehow Russia would then say, yes, okay, everything's closed, we've finished with this conflict. Nobody can trust anything. So that's one problem. The second question is that this also seems to not really take into account the fact that this isn't really a war that Russia is pursuing against Ukraine. This is a war that Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin, sees that it's playing and fighting against the West. That's a week or so ago, Putin described Ukraine as not really having military forces, that this was a NATO legion. In other words, he believes that the Euromaidan was a Western finance coup, that the Ukraine is just a satellite, a proxy state of the West, and that the West is working, NATO in particular, and the US are working through Ukraine to try and surround Russia with anti-Russian alleged states. So it's not even a question of the Euromaidan, NATO and EU. Putin wants a fight with the West and he's picked Ukraine for that. More importantly, if we allow Putin, if Ukraine capitulates, as these realists argue, and we allow Putin to get everything that he demanded, what is to stop him going elsewhere? Former NATO Secretary General today said that there is a threat from Russia, a potential threat from Russia towards the Baltic states. It's not the case, as the realists argue, that Russia would suddenly stop at Ukraine and not go elsewhere. If Russia's aim, as I argue, is really to undermine the European security architecture built since World War II, built on the basis of NATO, EU, and the OSCE, then Ukraine is just the first step. Particularly, Putin's aim is to show that NATO is not a serious organization and that NATO members will not come to the aid of another if it's attacked. And so we can certainly imagine that little green men will suddenly magically appear in Latvia and Estonia if Ukraine capitulates, if the Ukraine is pushed to capitulate to Russia according to these realist scenarios. Latvia has a bigger Russian language speaking population than Ukraine, 50% of its population. Riga is far more of a Russian speaking city than Kiev. And in Estonia you have a region of eastern Estonia around the city of Narva, which is Estonia's Donbas. And it could easily be a potential area of intrusion of Russian green men. These are very small populations. There would be a testing case for what would be NATO's resolve. And if NATO didn't really believe there was a Russian threat, why is NATO now establishing forward military response bases and troops on the ground in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states? So I think the realists really want us to believe there isn't a Russian threat, that somehow Putin is benign, he has realistic interests, that he wants to defend his sphere of interest, is denying the essence of what is Russia today. And what is Russia today? Well, it's actually more dangerous than Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Why? Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and Russia today both certainly use the same argument that they want to defend their co-ethnic or language speakers, Germans in the case of the 1930s, or Russian speakers, which, by the way, Vladimir Putin sees as one and the same thing, around Russia today. So that means particularly Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. But Russia's far worse than Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was a dictatorship, a horrible regime. I know this, both my parents suffered from the Nazis. But it wasn't a mafia state in the sense of today's Russia, which is tied to organized crime. Today's Russia, if you look at the investigations which have been reopened in London just a week ago into the assassination of Russian exile Litvinenko in 2006, look at the documents revealed in the courtroom from British intelligence, which I'm sure at the time were shared with the Americans and with their NATO allies. This points to a regime in Moscow and the Russian leadership which ordered this nuclear terrorism in London. We also know from leaked US diplomatic cables known as WikiLeaks, going back even as far as 2010, where Russia is described as a mafia state in those US diplomatic cables. So we have not only a Russia that's different because it's a mafia state compared to Nazi Germany. Yes, both countries are fascist dictatorships. In the case of Russia, fascist. In the case of Germany, Nazi. But Russia trumps Adolf Hitler in two ways. Firstly, its leadership has been tied to organized crime since the 1990s. Karen DeWish's new book goes into that in extreme detail and ties Vladimir Putin to the Petersburg mafia and criminal elements going all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s. But secondly, it's also different to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't have nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. So we have a nuclear fascist mafia state. This makes it extremely difficult to see where the realist argument really has a point on the case of Ukraine. As to the other argument put forward not just by realists, by the way, but also put forward by those who want to make excuses for countries not helping Ukraine, such as Canada. It's interesting that in the last week or so, when there's been a massive publication of editorials and commentaries in the British and American media in support of the sending of arms to Ukraine, not a single article and editorial has appeared in the Canadian media in support of this. Why that's the case is difficult to know. But the articles which have appeared in the past in the Canadian media have argued along similar lines to the realists that we can't send arms to a corrupt country such as Ukraine. Well, sorry, we've never sent arms to corrupt countries in the past. What the hell were we doing with Pakistan since the 1980s? Pakistan's not corrupt. We haven't been sending billions of dollars of military assistance to Pakistan. We haven't been training their forces. Why are Canadian special forces training the Iraqis? Is Iraq not corrupt? Why are we sending weapons to a militia, the Kurdish militia, to fight ISIS? Are they an army of a state? No. They're a paramilitary militia, which is also involved in a very corrupt part of Iraq. So the idea that we can't send weapons to Ukraine because they're corrupt is ridiculous, particularly because it's not just a question of sending defensive weaponry. What I would argue, which is just as vital, is the sending of training and advice. And you can't steal training and advice. It's brought by individuals. And the second phony argument made sometimes in the Canadian media and elsewhere, and I was asked this question today on CBC, is, well, so where's this equipment going to go? Is it going to go to far-right volunteer battalions? No, the Americans have said all along that any military support to Ukraine, if it is going to be sent, and the pressure is building up on President Obama for this, would be sent to the Ukrainian military, not to the volunteer battalions, because it's important to build up the Ukrainian military. So that's also a second canard, which doesn't really have any relevance. What to me is surprising as well is the degree to which in the Canadian Parliament there's no equivalent at all of the Ukraine Freedom Support Act adopted by the US Congress in December. Why is the Ukrainian community in Canada not lobbying, and why are pro-Ukrainian members of the Canadian Parliament not pushing for a similar kind of piece of legislation to what was adopted in the US? And why is Canada always looking over its shoulder at what the US is doing? Why can Canada not make its own decision about whether to support Ukraine with lethal defensive weaponry and training? If Canadian Special Forces can be in Iraq training special forces, why can't they be in Kiev? So I think that the realist position is not only Russophile, it's disingenuous, it's naive, and it deals with issues which are not really there. If the whole point of the realist argument is to play up to Moscow's fears about Ukraine integrating with the West, well, let's be quite frank. Ukraine is not about to join NATO or the EU in the very near future. This is only a potential objective. It's an objective like, in many ways, other people have objectives. It could be fulfilled, it could be not. Whether Ukraine joins NATO down the road depends on a huge array of factors, including whether all NATO members support that. Currently, key Western European countries like the French and Germans do not support Ukraine joining NATO. And Ukraine would have to undertake some very, very important military and security reforms, particularly in weeding out Russian agents. And just this week, a senior member of the Ukrainian military command was arrested in Kiev for being a Russian agent. That's the degree to which there was Russian penetration of Ukraine's security forces under Viktor Yanukovych. But of the question of the European Union, well, again, Turkey's been wanting to join the European Union for decades and it's still not joined. So this is only an objective. When and if Ukraine can join will be dependent on, firstly, whether European countries want Ukraine to join, but more importantly, on whether the Ukrainians will stop talking and begin acting on implementing overdue reforms and fighting corruption. And whereas some reforms are taking place because there isn't really any alternative, I don't see at this moment in time any seriousness on the part of President Poroshenko in fighting corruption. And his Prosecutor General, Mr. Yarema, just keeps making excuses about not putting former senior members of the Yanukovych regime on trial rather than actually doing some action. So this canard that we have to play up to Putin's demand that Ukraine never join EU and NATO is really an unrealistic demand, because although Ukraine has outlined those as objectives, they are very far away from being potentially implemented. The objectives of Ukraine are really to deal with its domestic economic and financial and corruption crises inherited primarily from the previous regime. That's a second front to the military front, and the situation isn't getting any better. But at the same time, Ukraine also has to have support from the West in terms of defensive military equipment. Hopefully, if and when the Americans go ahead with that, even if it means not giving the equipment, but opening up lines of credit where Ukraine as a country which is not under any international embargo could actually buy or lease the equipment from the US. Then after that, Canada, Britain, and Poland could follow the US in providing some kind of lethal defensive equipment and training. But then Ukraine needs to have objectives as to what it really wants to do on the ground. And that's another question which I think we should discuss in a separate video blog. Thank you.